J. Robert Oppenheimer didn't lose his security clearance because he was a spy. He lost it because he opposed building a weapon that could end human civilization. In April 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission convened a secret hearing to determine whether Oppenheimer, the man who built America's first atomic bomb, should keep his security clearance. But the 4-week proceeding was a predetermined execution disguised as due process, with FBI wiretaps used as evidence, former friends coerced into testifying against him, and a conclusion written before testimony even began by officials who needed to silence the scientists questioning whether hydrogen bombs were moral or necessary. This video reveals why Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb made him a target for political destruction, how FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover built a surveillance file on him that spanned decades and thousands of pages, what witnesses said during the hearing that destroyed his reputation, why Edward Teller's testimony became the death blow that Oppenheimer never recovered from, and how documents declassified in 2014 proved the hearing was rigged from the beginning. A show trial designed to eliminate the moral voice challenging America's nuclear weapons program. The hearing room was smaller than expected. Room 2022, Atomic Energy Commission Building, Washington, D.C., April 12. Gray walls, one long table. Chairs arranged like a courtroom but without the formality. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting everything in harsh white. J. Robert Oppenheimer sat at the table reserved for the accused. Gray suit, thin frame, pork pie hat resting on the chair beside him. He'd worn that hat walking in. Reporters outside had photographed him, the man who built the atomic bomb now sitting for judgment. Across from him, the gray board. 3 men appointed to determine if Oppenheimer was a security risk to the United States. Gordon Gray, chairman, former Secretary of the Army. The others, a university president and an industrialist. None were scientists. None understood the physics Oppenheimer had mastered, but they would decide his fate. To Oppenheimer's right, his attorney, Lloyd Garrison, competent, earnest, unaware that the case was already lost. Roger Robb, the AEC's special counsel, sat opposite. Sharp, aggressive, armed with something Oppenheimer's team didn't know about, a complete FBI file, wiretap transcripts, surveillance reports, decades of Oppenheimer's private conversations, meetings, relationships, all documented, all classified, all weaponized for this moment. Gordon Gray opened the proceedings. His voice was measured, professional. Dr. Oppenheimer, this board has been convened to determine whether the suspension of your security clearance should be made permanent. You understand the nature of these proceedings? Oppenheimer nodded. I do. What he didn't understand yet. The decision had already been made. Gray had drafted the conclusion weeks earlier, before the first witness testified, before Oppenheimer spoke a word in his own defense. The hearing would last 40 days, generate 3,000 pages of testimony, feature 40 witnesses. But it was theater, a carefully constructed performance designed to destroy the man who had become inconvenient, not because he'd betrayed his country, but because he'd questioned whether building weapons of infinite destruction served any moral purpose. The transcript of that hearing would remain classified for decades. When finally released, it would reveal not a search for truth but a political execution with legal paperwork. Oppenheimer sat in that gray room and watched his life being dismantled. One witness at a time, one old association weaponized, one private conversation exposed. He'd built the bomb that ended World War II, saved potentially millions of lives by shortening the Pacific Campaign. And now, 9 years later, his reward was this, a secret hearing where the government would systematically prove he was dangerous, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he refused to do next. J. Robert Oppenheimer became a security risk the moment he opposed the hydrogen bomb. Not before. Before he was a hero, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, the man who assembled the greatest collection of physicists in history at Los Alamos and delivered a working atomic weapon in under 3 years. President Truman awarded him the Medal for Merit in 1946. Oppenheimer appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He advised the government on nuclear policy, chaired the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. But in 1949, everything changed. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The nuclear monopoly was over. American officials panicked. The solution, they decided, was escalation. Build the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Edward Teller championed it. A super bomb, fusion-based, theoretically unlimited in destructive power. The General Advisory Committee, chaired by Oppenheimer, was asked to evaluate whether the United States should pursue the hydrogen bomb program. In October 1949, Oppenheimer and the committee issued their recommendation. No, not because it was technically impossible, but because it was morally indefensible. The committee's report. That recommendation made Oppenheimer a target. President Truman ignored the advice, ordered the hydrogen bomb program to proceed in January 1950. Teller got his super. But Oppenheimer's opposition didn't end. He continued arguing publicly that the U.S. was engaged in a dangerous arms race that could only end in catastrophe, that building weapons designed to annihilate entire populations served no strategic purpose. He advocated for international control of atomic energy, for sharing scientific knowledge to prevent proliferation, for arms limitations before the race became irreversible. These positions made powerful people nervous. Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, viewed Oppenheimer as an obstacle. The military establishment saw him as defeatist. Hardliners considered him soft on communism. But they couldn't simply fire him. Oppenheimer was too prominent, too respected in the scientific community. His war record was unimpeachable. They needed a reason, a legal framework, something that would justify removing him from influence while destroying his credibility so thoroughly that no one would take his warnings seriously anymore. So they looked into his past, and they found associations, old friendships, brief memberships, relationships from the 1930s that could be reframed as evidence of disloyalty. The FBI had been watching Oppenheimer since J. Edgar Hoover opened a file on him before the Manhattan Project even began. Reason: Oppenheimer had attended Communist Party meetings in the 1930s, had friends and relatives who were party members, and had been in a relationship with Jean Tatlock, a known communist. None of this was secret. Army intelligence knew about it when they appointed Oppenheimer to lead Los Alamos in 19. General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, personally vouched for him despite the association. He's essential to the project, Groves told security officials. We can't do this without him. So Oppenheimer was cleared, given the highest security access, put in charge of the most classified program in American history. But the FBI never stopped watching. For 12 years, Hoover's agents maintained surveillance on Oppenheimer. They tapped his phones at Princeton, at Berkeley, in Los Alamos. They intercepted his mail. They followed him to meetings. They documented everyone he spoke with. By 1954, the FBI file on J. Robert Oppenheimer was over 7,000 pages. It contained transcripts of private conversations with his wife, notes on his political statements, records of donations to left-wing causes, lists of everyone he'd ever associated with who had communist connections, however tangential. The file also contained testimony from informants, people who attended the same meetings Oppenheimer had in the 1930s, friends who'd been pressured by FBI agents to report on his activities, colleagues who'd been interviewed and selectively quoted to make associations sound more sinister than they were. This file became the weapon used against Oppenheimer in December 1953, Lewis Strauss delivered a letter to Oppenheimer. It detailed 24 charges, derogatory information that called into question his loyalty and judgment. Most charges related to activities from the 1930s and early 1940s. Attending meetings, knowing people, making donations, having relationships. Nothing illegal, nothing recent, nothing that hadn't been known and cleared before. But the letter also included a new charge. Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb raises questions about his motives. The implication was clear. Perhaps his opposition wasn't based on moral concerns. Perhaps it served Soviet interests. The letter offered Oppenheimer a choice: resign quietly and keep his reputation, or request a hearing to clear his name. Oppenheimer chose the hearing. He believed truth would vindicate him, that his service, his achievements, his loyalty would speak for themselves. He didn't know the hearing was designed not to discover truth, but to create a record justifying a decision already made. Gordon Gray received his appointment to chair the hearing board in March 19. He also received instructions, not officially, not in writing, but clearly. The Atomic Energy Commission wanted Oppenheimer's clearance revoked. Gray's job was to provide legal cover for that outcome. Years later, documents declassified under the Freedom of Information Act revealed that Gray had written his conclusion that Oppenheimer was a security risk before the hearing began. He drafted the language, outlined the reasoning, determined the verdict. Then the hearing proceeded as if it were a legitimate investigation. The process was stacked against Oppenheimer from the start. Roger Robb, the AEC's counsel, had access to Oppenheimer's complete FBI file, every wiretap transcript, every surveillance report, every informant statement. Lloyd Garrison, Oppenheimer's attorney, had none of this. He wasn't cleared to see the classified evidence being used against his client, couldn't prepare effective cross-examination, couldn't challenge the accuracy of statements taken out of context. The rules of evidence didn't apply. Hearsay was admissible. Witnesses could testify about decades-old conversations without documentation. The board could consider classified information Oppenheimer wasn't allowed to see or rebut. It wasn't a trial, it was an inquisition. Rob's strategy was simple. Use Oppenheimer's own words against him. Quote selectively from wiretapped conversations where Oppenheimer had expressed doubts about security procedures, or made casual comments about colleagues, or discussed political matters. Every statement was presented in the worst possible light. Every association exaggerated. Every youthful indiscretion treated as evidence of ongoing disloyalty. Oppenheimer tried to explain context, that the 1930s were a different time, that many intellectuals had explored leftist politics before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, that his associations were social, not ideological. But explanations sounded like excuse. Defense sounded like evasion. And Rob had one advantage Oppenheimer couldn't counter. He knew everything. Every private conversation, every bedroom discussion with Oppenheimer's wife Kitty about whether to attend a meeting or donate to a cause. Privacy had been eliminated. Every moment of Oppenheimer's adult life had been documented and could be weaponized. The hearing revealed what surveillance makes possible. A complete record of someone's life, curated and presented to make them look guilty of anything investigators want to prove. 40 witnesses testified during the hearing. Many defended Oppenheimer. Scientists from Los Alamos vouched for his loyalty. Colleagues described his brilliance and service. Former students spoke of his integrity. But the damage came from others. People who had reasons, professional, personal, political, to distance themselves from Oppenheimer, or who were pressured by the FBI to cooperate. The most devastating testimony came from those who knew him best and betrayed him anyway. Dr. Edward Teller took the stand on April 28, 1954. Teller was a brilliant physicist, a colleague from Los Alamos. They'd worked together on the atomic bomb, but Teller had championed the hydrogen bomb, while Oppenheimer opposed it, creating a professional rift that became personal. Garrison asked Teller directly, "Do you believe Dr. Oppenheimer is a security risk?" Teller paused. The room waited. In a great number of cases, I have seen Dr. Oppenheimer act in a way which for me was exceedingly hard to understand. I thoroughly disagreed with him on numerous issues, and his actions frankly appeared to me confused and complicated. To this extent, I feel I would like to see the vital interests of this country in hands which I understand better and therefore trust more. Not a direct accusation, but devastating in its implication. I don't trust him with national security. The board seized on this. If Teller, Oppenheimer's colleague, someone who knew him well, couldn't vouch for his reliability, what did that mean? Oppenheimer was shattered. After the hearing, he said, "I was prepared for many things, but not for that." Teller's testimony effectively ended Oppenheimer's career. The scientific community never forgave Teller. He became a pariah at physics conferences, but his statement gave the Gray Board exactly what it needed. Other witnesses were less subtle. Former communists who'd known Oppenheimer in the 1930s testified about meetings he'd attended. They described party activities in dramatic terms, exaggerating Oppenheimer's involvement to satisfy FBI handlers who'd threatened them with perjury charges if they weren't helpful. One witness claimed Oppenheimer had hosted a party meeting at his home. Oppenheimer denied it. The witness had no documentation, but the charge went into the record. Another described Oppenheimer as sympathetic to Soviet positions, based on conversations from Again, no documentation, just memory shaded by time and pressure. Each testimony added to a narrative. Oppenheimer had once been too close to communists. Maybe he still was. Maybe his opposition to the H-bomb served their interests. The logic was circular. Oppenheimer opposed certain weapons policies. Communists would benefit if America didn't build those weapons. Therefore, Oppenheimer's opposition was suspicious. That this reasoning made every policy disagreement potential evidence of disloyalty didn't seem to concern the board. The hearing concluded on May 6, 1954. Gordon Gray and the board retired to deliberate. The process took 3 weeks. The transcript was reviewed, arguments considered, evidence weighed. On May 27, the board issued its decision. J. Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance should not be reinstated. The reasoning, as documented in the board's report. We find that Dr. Oppenheimer's continuing conduct and associations have reflected a serious disregard for the requirements of the security system. Not that he was disloyal, not that he'd committed espionage, Not that he'd betrayed secrets, just that his associations and conduct, undefined, unspecified, demonstrated disregard for security. The board acknowledged Oppenheimer's contributions. We have given particular attention to his outstanding services to the nation, but we find his associations and attitudes to be disturbing. Translation: thank you for building the bomb. Now go away. Two of the three board members signed the decision. The third, Ward Evans, dissented. Evans wrote, "To damn him now and ruin his career and his service, I cannot do it." But he was outvoted. The decision stood. The Atomic Energy Commission reviewed the board's recommendation. On June 29, 1954, they made it final. Oppenheimer's Q clearance, the highest security access in the U.S. government, was revoked. His consulting contracts ended. His advisory positions terminated. His influence over nuclear policy eliminated. Oppenheimer was 50 years old. He had decades of productive scientific work ahead, but he would never again participate in government weapons programs or nuclear policy decisions. The hearing accomplished exactly what it was designed to: remove Oppenheimer from any position where he could question the wisdom of building weapons of mass annihilation. The scientific community was horrified. Many viewed the hearing as a witch hunt. Some physicists refused government contracts in protest. Others spoke out against the security system that could destroy someone for holding unpopular opinions. But the damage was done. Oppenheimer's reputation was tarnished, his voice silenced, his moral authority eliminated, and the hydrogen bomb program continued without his interference. Edward Teller got his super. The arms race accelerated. By 1961, the Soviet Union had tested a 50-megaton bomb, the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated. The United States built thousands of warheads. The world came to the brink of annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everything Oppenheimer had warned about, the dangerous escalation, the hair-trigger tensions, the possibility of accidental war, came to pass. But he wasn't there to say, "I told you so." He'd been removed from the conversation years earlier. The hearing had served its purpose, silencing the scientist who asked if there were limits to what should be built, even if it could be built. For decades, the hearing was treated as legitimate, flawed perhaps, but a genuine security review. Then in 2014, documents were declassified that revealed the truth. Gordon Gray's personal files showed he'd drafted the conclusion, finding Oppenheimer a security risk before testimony began. The language he used in the final report matched drafts from March 1954 before the first witness testified. Other documents revealed FBI coordination with the AEC. Hoover's agents had provided Roger Robb with the complete surveillance file and coached him on which wiretaps to reference for maximum effect. Letters between AEC officials discussed the hearing in terms of building a record that would justify removal of Oppenheimer, not whether he was a security risk, whether they could make it appear he was one. The hearing was never about discovering truth. It was about constructing a legal narrative that justified a predetermined political outcome. One document, released in 2022 during the Biden administration's review of the case, was particularly damning. A memo from Lewis Strauss to Gordon Gray, dated March 15, 1954, 4 weeks before the hearing began. The memo outlined the necessary conclusions the hearing should reach. It specified which associations should be emphasized, which witnesses should be called, which aspects of Oppenheimer's testimony should be highlighted as evasive. It was a script. Gray had followed it precisely. When the Strauss memo was made public, legal scholars described the 1954 hearing as one of the most blatant examples of procedural abuse in modern American history. A hearing where the judge wrote the verdict before evidence was heard, where the prosecutor had unlimited access to classified surveillance while defense counsel was kept in the dark, where witnesses were coerced, where privacy was eliminated, and every statement taken out of context. It wasn't justice. It was political assassination with paperwork. J. Robert Oppenheimer never recovered from the hearing. He continued as director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, continued publishing papers, continued lecturing, but the fire was gone. Friends described him as diminished, defeated. He believed in American institutions, believed they operated fairly, that truth mattered, that service counted for something. The hearing destroyed that belief, showed him that when you become inconvenient, when your moral questions threaten powerful interests, institutions will destroy you using your own words, your own associations, your own past. Oppenheimer rarely spoke about the hearing afterward. When asked, he would say simply, "I was tried and convicted. There's nothing more to say." He died in 1967, at age 62, from throat cancer. His security clearance was never reinstated during his lifetime. The broader cost was to American science and policy. After Oppenheimer's destruction, scientists learned the lesson. Don't question weapons policy. Don't raise moral objections. Don't oppose programs the military wants. The chilling effect was immediate. Physicists stopped advising the government on arms control. The scientific community withdrew from policy debates, fearing they'd be next. The arms race accelerated without the moderating voices of those who understood the weapons best. Strategic decisions were made by military planners and politicians who treated nuclear weapons as just bigger bombs, not civilization-ending technology, requiring fundamentally different thinking. Some historians argue the Cuban Missile Crisis might have been avoided if scientists like Oppenheimer had been involved in arms control negotiations during the 1950s, providing technical expertise and moral framing that might have created different outcomes. But those scientists had been silenced. Oppenheimer's destruction served as warning: challenge the weapons program, and we'll destroy you using your own life as evidence against you. The message was received. The silence was maintained. And the world came within minutes of nuclear war in October 1962, because the people who knew better had been removed from the conversation years earlier. On December 16, 2022, 68 years after the hearing, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm issued an order vacating the 1954 decision to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. The order stated, "The 1954 security hearing was a flawed process that violated the Commission's own regulations. More importantly, it was a process that allowed national security concerns to be misused to discredit and intimidate a scientist who raised legitimate questions about nuclear weapons policy." The decision was symbolic. Oppenheimer had been dead for 55 years, but it was also an acknowledgement. The hearing was wrong. The process was corrupted. The outcome was unjust. The order didn't just clear Oppenheimer, it repudiated the entire proceeding as fundamentally illegitimate. In his statement announcing the decision, President Biden said, "Dr. Oppenheimer's contributions to our national security and scientific advancement are undeniable. The process used to question his loyalty was a product of Cold War paranoia and political calculation, not genuine security concerns. We owe him better, even 68 years late." The scientific community welcomed the vindication, but many noted the bitter irony. Oppenheimer was cleared only after everyone who participated in destroying him was dead. No one faced accountability. No institutions reformed, no safeguards enacted to prevent future political persecution disguised as security review. The same surveillance powers that built the file used against Oppenheimer still exist. The same classification systems that allowed prosecutors access to evidence defendants couldn't see still operate. The same ability to weaponize someone's associations and private statements against them remains available to any administration determined enough to use it. Oppenheimer was vindicated, but the system that destroyed him was never dismantled. And that means somewhere in some classified hearing room, another scientist or policy expert who asks inconvenient questions could face the same fate: surveillance converted to evidence, associations exaggerated, privacy eliminated, and due process reduced to theater. Oppenheimer's clearance was restored 68 years too late to matter. But the lesson remains urgently relevant. When security becomes a weapon instead of a safeguard, anyone who challenges authority becomes vulnerable to destruction, using their own life as ammunition. Atomic Energy Commission Building, Washington, D.C. Room 2022 doesn't exist anymore. The building was renovated decades ago. The hearing room was converted to office space. The table where Oppenheimer sat gone. But the transcript remains. 3,000 pages documenting 40 days of testimony, cross-examination, and procedural abuse. Page 726 captures the moment Edward Teller destroyed Oppenheimer, with carefully chosen words. Page 1847 shows Gordon Gray's questioning, already knowing the conclusion he'd written weeks earlier. The transcript is housed now in the National Archives, available for research, a document of how political power disguised as security concern can systematically destroy someone who became inconvenient. April 12, 19. J. Robert Oppenheimer walked in believing truth would vindicate him. He didn't know Gordon Gray had already written the verdict. He didn't know Roger Robb had access to every private conversation from 12 years of FBI surveillance. He didn't know Edward Teller would deliver the killing blow disguised as measured disagreement. 40 days, 40 witnesses, 3,000 pages of transcript. The conclusion was written before the first word was spoken. Not because Oppenheimer was a spy, because he opposed building weapons that could end human civilization, because he asked whether there should be limits on what we create, even if we can create it, because he raised moral questions that threatened political and military power. The hearing destroyed him. 68 years later, it was declared unjust. But the system that made it possible still exists. Room 2022 is gone, but the transcript remains. A record of what happens when security becomes a weapon, when surveillance becomes evidence, when inconvenient questions become proof of disloyalty. Oppenheimer built the bomb that ended World War II, and America repaid him by using his own words, his own friends, his own life to prove he was dangerous. Not for what he'd done, for what he refused to do next.